ago, I was watching a video on YouTube, a guy that I used to work with. Um, his name is Darius Lindsay, but he goes by the YouTube handle name Lanky Hustles because he his channel is centered more on side deals and side hustles, and he also is tall as hell. That's why he goes by the name Lanky Hustles, because he's like 6'5", 6'6", around there. But I used to work with him at one of my old jobs, and he referenced my channel. Let's see if this is it. Okay, I might have spelled that wrong. Let me see. Um, but his channel is mainly centered on his trucking. Basically, he works CDL. Basically, he's a CDL driver. But I used to work with him at Valvo Lane over in Crown Point, Indiana. And I'm trying to find his name here. Here, let me see if I can find it on my tablet. But I know I have him on my YouTube channel. But he referenced my channel, so he gave me a shout out. So I felt like the least I can do was reference his channel. Um, let's see if I can find his name. And I know I have it on here. Yeah, right here. Okay, so this is his YouTube channel, and and in the video where he talked about his experience as a school bus driver, that's the video that he references my channel, at least one of them, the RBW King channel, where I talk about my struggles with UPS right now and stuff like that. So that was so in that video he references my channel, RBW King, and I was grateful that he did that, because it's like, and then also yesterday, I just want to put a little story out before I start my actual video here. So yesterday, me and one of the guys that stays here went to the mall, Orland Park Mall, because he went to go get a tablet for his job. Of course, he needed like an iPad tablet for his job. And then we stopped at this bookstore, and I got this baseball encyclopedia, about 4,000 pages worth. So you can see how fucking huge this book is. But yeah, that's not a bad thing. I love reading. So, also, right in the Orland Park Mall area, there's two bookstores. You have Half Price Books, which is where I got that book from. And then there's Barnes & Noble. And I thought they closed all the Barnes & Nobles down, but found out there's still a couple around. So that's that. And now we're going to get into the main story. Today, we are going to talk about Joan of Arc. Sarah McAllister joins in. Hi, Sarah. I don't know where you're from, but it's good to see you joined in. Joan of Arc was a patron saint of France. And she was honored. And so Joan of Arc was born in the year 1412 and died on May 30th of 1431. She was estimated to be between the ages of 18 and 19 when she died, and stuff like that. So, but she was honored as a defender of the French nation for her role in the siege of Orleans, and her insistence on the coronation of Charles VII of France during the 100-Year War. Now she was claiming to be acting under divine guidance, but she became a military leader who transcended gender roles and gained recognition as the savior of France. And now Joan of Arc was born to a propertied peasant family in Damery in northeast France. Now, in 1428, she was requested to be taken to Charles VII, later testifying that she was guided by visions from the Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine to help him save France from English domination. Now, convinced of her devotion and purity, Charles would send Joan, who was about 17 years old at the time, to the siege of Orleans as part of a relief army. Now, she arrived in the city in April of 1429, wielding her banner and bringing hope to the demoralized French army. Now, 9 days after her arrival, the English the siege. Now, Joan encouraged the French to aggressively pursue the English during the Luray campaign, which culminated in another decisive victory at Patay. Um, Now, this opened the way for the French army to advance in Reims unopposed, where Charles was crowned as the King of France with Joan at his side. Um, Now, these victories would boost French morale, paving the way for their final triumph in the Hundred Years' War several decades later. Um, now, Now, after Charles's coronation, Joan participated in the unsuccessful siege of Paris in September of 1429 and the failed siege La Charite in November. Now, I'm not sure if I'm saying these names right. In November. But her role in these defeats reduced the court's faith in her. In early 1430, Joan organized a company of volunteers to relieve Compiègne, which had been besieged by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. Um, excuse me. Um, Now, after trying unsuccessfully to escape, let's see. Now, okay, she was captured by the Burgundian troops on May 23rd, but after trying unsuccessfully to escape, she was handed to the English in November. She was put on trial by Bishop Pierre Cauchon on accusations of heresy, which included blasphemy by wearing men's clothes, acting upon visions that were demonic, and refusing um, um, and refusing to submit her words and deeds to the judgment of the church. She was declared guilty and burned at the cross on May 30th of 1431, and estimated to be between the ages of 18 and 19. Now, in 1456, an inquisitional court investigated Joan's trial and overturned the verdict, declaring that it was tainted by deceit and procedural errors. Now, Joan has been described as an obedient daughter of the Roman Catholic Church, an early feminist and a symbol of freedom and independence. She is popularly revered as a martyr, but after the French Revolution, she became a national symbol of France. In 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized by Pope Benedict the 15th, and 2 years later she was declared one of the patron saints of France. And she is portrayed in numerous movies, literature, music, paintings, and sculptures, and numerous cultural works. If you want to see a good Joan of Arc movie, watch the one with Mila Jovovich, who plays in Resident Evil. And she played her in the movie. Great movie, if you ask me. Now, Joan of Arc's name was written in a many variety of ways. Now, there was no standard spelling to her name before the 16th century. Her last name was usually written as Dark without an apostrophe, but there are variants such as Tark, Dart, or Day. Her father's name was written as Tart at her trial, and she was called Jean Domeray and Charles the 7th 1429 letter granting her a coat of arms. Now, Joan may have never referred to herself as Joan d'Arc, the first as Jean d'Arc, but the first written record of her being called by this name is in 1455, 24 years after she died. She was kind of illiterate in the aspect of she did not know how to read or write. Back then, a lot of people didn't. Okay, so basically, she never learned to read or write in her childhood, and so dictated her letters. She may later have learned to sign her name, as some of her letters are signed, and she may have even learned to read a little bit. But Joan referred to herself in the letters as Joan the Maiden, or as the Maiden, emphasizing her virginity, and she signed Jeanne. In the 16th century, she became known as the Maid of Orleans. Yeah, but if you think about this, when she got burned at the stake, that is a painful way to die, being burnt alive. That is painful, being burnt alive. Um, I can never see myself being burned or and stuff like that. But that is painful to die being burnt at the cross. Um, and it's so freaking hot out too. I'm sweating. So I'm thinking, what's more brutal, being burned at the stake, or pressing to death? Um, Pressing to death was done back during the Salem witch trials, where they would where they that if you were found guilty of being a warlock or a wizard or like a witch or a wizard, type thing, they would lay you down on the floor, and they would put boulders on you that were heavy, that would crush you to death. That's another painful way that they killed people back then, other than the electric chair. The electric chair is when you get electrocuted to death. That's another painful way to die. But now it's more like they um, now the more now they don't do the electric chair that much anymore, but now they do the lethal injection for the people on death row. Um, yeah, pressing to death is painful other than being burned. So Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in France, um, and it was a small village in France. But her date of birth is unknown, and her statements about her age are very vague. Um, Her parents were Jacques and Isabel. Joan had three brothers and a sister. Her father was a peasant farmer who owned about 50 acres of land, and he supplemented the family income as a village official, collecting taxes and heading the local watch. Um, Now, Joan of Arc was born during the Hundred-Year War between England and France, which had begun in 1337. Um, Over the status of English territories in France and English claims to the French throne. Nearly all the fighting had taken place in France, devastating its economy back then. Um, at the time of Joan's birth, France was divided politically. The French King Charles VI had recurring, or no, sorry, yeah, six. The French King Charles VI had recurring bouts of mental illness and was often unable to rule. Um, his brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, and his cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, had quarreled um, over the regency of France in 1407. Now, the Duke of Burgundy ordered the assassination of the Duke of Orleans, precipitating an early civil war. Now, Charles of Orleans succeeded her father. Had succeeded their father as Duke at the age of 13, and was placed in the custody of Bernard, who was the Count of Armagnac. Now, his supporters became known as Armagnacs, while supporters of the Duke of Burgundy became known as Burgundians. Now, um, now, the future French King Charles VII had assumed the title of Dauphin, which means heir to the throne, after the deaths of his four older brothers, and was associated with the Armagnacs. Um, Now, Henry V of England exploited France's internal divisions when he invaded in 1415. Now, the Burgundians took Paris in 1418. In 1419, the Dauphin had offered a truce to negotiate peace with the Duke of Burgundy, but the Duke was assassinated by the Dauphin's Armagnac partisans during the negotiations. So that kind of killed any deal. Um, Now, the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had associated himself with the English. Now, Charles VI accused the Dauphin of murdering the Duke of Burgundy and declared him unfit to inherit the French throne. But during this time period of illness, Charles's wife Isabeau of Bavaria stood in for him and signed the Treaty of Troyes, which gave their daughter Catherine of Valois in marriage to Henry V, granting the succession of the French throne to their heir, and effectively disinherited the Dauphin. This caused rumors that the Dauphin was not King Charles VI's son, but the offspring of an adulterous affair between Isabeau and the murdered Duke of Orleans. Um, Now, in 1422, Henry V and Charles VI died within 2 months of each other. but the 9-month-old Henry VI of England was the normal heir of the Anglo-French dual monarchy as agreed agreed in the treaty, but the Dauphin also claimed the French throne. Um, Now, in her youth, Joan did a lot of household chores, which was common back then. She would spun wool, helped her father in the fields, and looked after the animals that they had. Um, her mother provided Joan's religious education. Now, much of Domeray lay in the Duchy of Bar. Now, whose precise feudal status was unclear. Though surrounded by the pro-Burgundian lands, its people were loyal to the Armagnac cause. By 1419, the war had affected the area, and in 1425, Domeray was attacked and cattle were stolen. Um, Now, this led to a sentiment among villagers that the English must be expelled from France to achieve the peace. Joan had her first vision after this raid. Um, Now, another one similar to this, even though he wasn't burned at the stake, was William Wallace. His death was actually by being stretched out. Basically, they stretched his body out to the point where it ripped, and that's how he would end up dying. That was a very brutal way too, and he was fighting for the independence of his country in Scotland. Um, I don't think I did a video on William Wallace, but I might put one up. Mel Gibson did a pretty good role for that one. But anyway, now Joan of Arc later testified that when she was 13, um, which was around the year 1425, a figure she identified as Saint Michael surrounded by angels appeared to her in her garden. Um, After this vision, she said she wept because she wanted them to take her with them. Now, throughout her life, um, she had visions of Saint Michael, a patron saint of the Domeray area. There are some pictures here I want to show, because that is a good thing to do. Um, this is supposedly what she looks like. Joan of Arc. So that is one picture. Let's go to another one, because there are a few here. This is the area of where she was born at. She was born in a town called Domeray, which, now I can't really see it on here, unless there was a way to zoom in. Yeah, but this is like the area where she was born at. Here's another one of her. But yeah, so you get the idea. So now, throughout her life, Joan of Arc had said that she had seen visions of Saint Michael, a patron saint of the Domeray area, who was seen as a defender of France. Now, she stated that these visions frequently. She stated that she had these visions frequently, and that she often had them when the church bells were rung. Her visions also included Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, although Joan never specified. They were probably Margaret of Antioch and Catherine of Alexandria. Now, those, no, those most known in the area, both were known as Virgin Saints who strove against powerful enemies. And they were tortured and martyred for their beliefs, and they preserved their virtue to the death. Joan testified that she swore a vow of virginity to these voices when a young man from her village alleged that she had broken a promise of marriage. Joan stated that she had made no promises, and his case was dismissed by an ecclesiastical court. Now, during Joan of Arc's youth, a prophecy circulated in the French countryside, based on the versions of Marie Robin of Avignon, had promised an armed virgin would come forth to save France. Now, another prophecy attributed to Merlin stated that a virgin carrying a banner would put an end to France's suffering, and Joan implied that she was this promised maiden, reminding the people around her that there was a saying that France would be destroyed by a woman but would be restored by a virgin. In May of 1428, she asked her uncle to take her to the nearby town of Bacoulers, where she petitioned the garrison commander, Robert de Baldecroix, for an armed escort to the Armagnac Count at Chinon. Now, Baldecroix harshly refused and sent her home. But in July, Marais, France was raided by Burgundian forces, which set fire to the town, destroying all the crops, and it forced Joan, her family, and the other townspeople that lived there to flee. She returned to the Bacoulers in January of 1429. Her petition was refused again, but by this time she had gained the support of two of the Baldecroix's soldiers, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poligny. Meanwhile, she was summoned to Nancy under safe conduct by Charles II, Duke of Lorraine, who had heard about Joan during her stay at Vaucouleurs. The Duke was ill and thought that she might have supernatural powers that could cure him. She offered no cures, but reprimanded him for living with his mistress. Back then, a lot of guys weren't loyal so back then, a lot of guys weren't loyal to their wives. They would sleep around back then. That's how they did it. And they would have a lot of children out of wedlock. Now Henry's brother, John of Lancaster, first Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had continued the English conquest of France. Now, most of northern France, Paris, and parts of southwestern France were under Anglo-Burgundian control. Now, the Burgundians controlled Reims, the traditional site for the coronation of French kings. Charles had not yet been crowned, but in doing so at Reims would help him legitimize his claim to the throne. Now, in July of 1428, the English had started to surround Orleans, or isolated it from the rest of Charles's territory by capturing many of the smaller bridge towns on the Loire River. Now, Orleans was strategically important as the last obstacle to an assault on the remainder of Charles's territory. Now, according to Joan's later testimony, it was around this period that her visions told her to leave John Marais to help the Dauphin Charles. Now, Baudricourt agreed to a third meeting with Joan in February of 1429. Now, around the time the English captured an Armagnac relief convoy at the Battle of the Herrings during the Siege of Orleans. Now, their conversations, along with Metz and Poligny's support, convinced Baudricourt to allow her to go to Chinon for an audience with the Dauphin. Joan traveled with an escort of 6 soldiers. Before leaving, Joan put on men's clothes, which were provided by the escorts and the people of Vaucouleurs, and she continued to wear men's clothes for the remainder of her life until she was captured and killed at the stake. Now, this is Charles VII of France's picture, supposedly. That's what he's supposed to look like if you go in close here. Yep, there we go. Okay. That's what he's supposed to look like. Now, Charles VII met Joan for the first time at the royal court in Chinon in late February or early March of 1429. Now, when she was 17 and he was 26, she told him that she had come to raise the siege of Orleans and to lead him to Reims for his coronation. Now, they had a private exchange that made a strong impression on Charles, and Jean Pasquerel, Joan's confessor, later testified that Joan told him that she had reassured the Dauphin that he was Charles VI's son and the legitimate king to that country. Now Charles and his council needed assurance. So they sent Joan to Poitiers to be examined by a council of theologians who declared that she was a good person and a good Catholic. They did not render a decision on the source of Joan's inspiration, but they agreed that sending her to Orleans could be useful for the king, and they would later test whether her inspiration was of divine origin. or just a sham. Now, Joan was then sent to tours to be physically examined by women, directed by Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, um, who verified her virginity, and this was to establish if she could indeed be the prophesied virgin savior of France. Um, Now, to show the purity of her devotion and to ensure that she had not consorted with any of the devils. Um, now, the Dolphin, reassured by the results of these tests, had commissioned plate armor for her to wear while she was in battle. She designed her own banner and had a sword brought to her from under the altar in the church of Saint Catherine Around this time, she began calling herself Joan the Maiden, emphasizing her virginity as a sign of her mission. Um, now, before Joan's arrival at Chinon, the Armagnac strategic situation was bad but not hopeless. Um, the Armagnac forces were prepared to endure a prolonged siege at Orleans. The Burgundians had recently withdrawn from the siege due to the disagreements about territory, and the English were debating whether to continue. Nonetheless, after almost a century of war, the Armagnacs were demoralized. But once Joan joined the Dolphins' cause, uh, her personality began to raise their spirits, inspiring devotion and the hope of divine assistance. Um, now, her belief in the divine origin of her mission turned the long-standing Anglo-French conflict over inheritance into a religious war. Before beginning the journey to Orleans, Joan dictated a letter to the Duke of Bedford, warning him that she was sent by God to drive him out of France. Um, Now, in the last week of April 1429, Joan was sent out from Blois as part of an army carrying supplies for the relief of Orleans. She arrived there on April 29th and met the commander Jean de Noy, the bastard of Orleans, is what they called him. Orleans was not completely cut off, and de Noy got into her and got her into the city, where she was greeted enthusiastically. Now, Joan was initially treated as a figurehead to raise morale, like a figurehead basically to raise morale, flying her banner on the battlefield. She was not given any formal command, which back then they really weren't, or included in any military councils, but quickly gained the support of the Armagnac troops. She always seemed to be present where the fighting was most intense, but she frequently stayed with the front ranks, and she gave them a sense she was fighting for their salvation. Now, Armagnac commanders would sometimes accept the advice that she gave them, such as deciding what position to attack, when to continue an assault, and how to place artillery. Now, on May 4th, oh shit, hold on. Let's see where I was at. Here. Okay, so on May 4th, the Armagnacs went on the offensive, attacking the outlying fortress of St. Loup. Once Joan learned of the attack, she rode out with her banner to the site of the battlefield. A mile east of Orleans, she read as the Armagnac soldiers were retreating after a failed assault. Her appearance rallied the soldiers, who attacked again and took the fortress on May 5th. No combat occurred since it was Ascension Thursday, which was the day of a feast. She dictated another letter to the English, warning them to leave France, and had it tied to a bolt, which was fired by a crossbowman. The Armagnacs resumed their offensive on May 6th, capturing Saint Jean de LeBlanc, which the English had deserted. Now, the Armagnac commanders wanted to stop, but Joan had encouraged them to launch an assault on Les Augustins, an English fortress built around a monastery. After its capture, the Armagnac commanders wanted to consolidate their gains, but Joan again argued for continuing the offensive here. On the morning of May 7th, the Armagnacs attacked the main English stronghold, Les Tourelles. Joan was wounded by an arrow between the neck and shoulder while holding her banner in the trench at the south bank of the river, but later returned to encourage the final assault that took the fortress. The English retreated from Orleans on May 8th, ending that siege. Um, yeah, the weather is so fucking hot today, and it's gonna get fucking hotter. I'm telling you, I'm already sweating. In my area, it's like 80 degrees out right now. Um, at Shannon, Joan had declared that she was sent by God, um, which wasn't true, but anyway. But at Poitiers, when she was asked to show a sign demonstrating this claim, she replied that it would be given if she were brought to Orleans. The lifting of the siege was interpreted by many people to be that sign. Prominent clergy such as Jacques Gallo, Archbishop of Embrun, and the theologian Jean Gerson, basically, sorry, tongue-tied, um, wrote treaties in support of Joan after this victory. In contrast, the English um, saw the ability of this peasant girl to defeat the armies as proof she was possessed by the devil, even though they couldn't claim it. Now here is a picture of Joan's what they call travel journey to Chinon, and you can see um, the green was the first trip she made, Orleans and Lorry campaign, and then there's this dotted line telling you that she's going to Reims and the Reims, and then you got and then the black are other locations like Chinon and Belochers and Domeray. You can see those right there. Um, Now, after the success at Orleans, Joan insisted that the Armagnac forces should advance promptly toward Reims to crown the Dauphin. Now, Charles allowed her to accompany the army under the command of John II, Duke of Alencon, who collaboratively worked with Joan and regularly would heed her advice, meaning he took her at her word. Um, now, before um, Now, before advancing toward Reims, the Armagnacs needed to recapture the bridge towns along the Loire of Jargeau, Mont-sur-Loire, and the Beaugency. Now, this would clear the way for Charles and his entourage, who would have to cross the Loire near Orleans to get from Chinon to Reims. Um, Now, the campaign to clear the Loire towns began on June 11th when the Armagnac forces, led by Alencon and Joan, arrived at Jargeau, and they forced the English to withdraw inside the town's walls. And Joan sent a message to the English people to surrender, but they refused. Um, a lot of people were stubborn bastards back then. Um, and she advocated for a direct assault on the walls the next day. By the end of the day, the town was taken. The Armagnac took few prisoners, and many of the English who surrendered were killed. But during this campaign, Joan continued to serve in the thick of the battle, and she began scaling a siege ladder with her banner in hand. Before she could climb the wall, she was struck by a stone which split her helmet. Um, Now, Alencon and Joan's army advanced on Meung-sur-Loire on June 15th. They took control of the town's bridge, and the English garrison withdrew to a castle on the Loire's north bank. Um, Most of the army continued on the south bank of the Loire to besiege the castle at the Beaugency, as they were saying here. Now, meanwhile, the English army from Paris, under the command of Sir John Fastolf, had linked up with the garrison in Meung and traveled along the north bank of the Loire to relieve Beaugency. Now, unaware of this, the English garrison at Beaugency surrendered on June 18th. The main English army retreated towards Paris, but Joan urged the Armagnacs to pursue them, and the two armies clashed at the Battle of Patay later that day. Now, the English had prepared their forces to ambush an Armagnac attack with hidden archers. Um, but the Armagnac vanguard detected and scattered around them. A rout ensued that decimated the English army, but Fastolf escaped with a small band of soldiers. But many of the English leaders were captured, and Joan arrived at the battlefield too late to participate in the decisive action. But her encouragement to pursue the English had made the victory possible. Um, Now, after the destruction of of the English army at Patay. Some Armagnac leaders argued for an invasion of English-held Normandy, but Joan remained insistent that Charles must be crowned. Um, and here's a picture of Charles being crowned. Um, right here. This is Charles VII being crowned. Um, now, the Dolphin agreed, and the army left Guienne on June 29th to march to Reims. The advancement was nearly unopposed, but the Burgundian-held town of Auxerre surrendered on July 3rd after 3 days of negotiations, and other towns in the army's path returned to Armagnac allegiance without any resistance. Now, and Troyes, which had a small garrison of English and Burgundian troops, was the only one to resist. After, not much, I'm just fucking sweating. Now, now the Burgundian the Burgundian troops were the only ones to resist, but after 4 days of negotiations, Joan had ordered the soldiers to fill the city's moat with wood and directed the replacement of artillery. Fearing an assault, Troyes negotiated a surrender. Now the town Reims opened up its gates on July 16th of 1429. Charles, Joan, and the army entered in the evening, and Charles's consecration took place the following morning, and Joan was given a place of honor at the ceremony and announced that God's will had been fulfilled. After the consecration, the royal court negotiated a truce of 15 days with the Duke of Burgundy, who had promised that he would try to arrange the transfer of Paris to the Armagnacs while continuing negotiations for a definitive peace. Now, at the end of this truce, Burgundy had reneged on the promise. Now, Joan and the Duke of Alencon favored a quick march on Paris, but divisions and Charles's court and continued peace negotiations with Burgundy led to a slow advance on this. Now, as the Armagnac army approached Paris, many of the towns along the way surrendered without a fight. On August 15th, the English forces under the Duke of Bedford had confronted the Armagnacs near Montpellier in a fortified position that the Armagnac commanders thought that was too strong to assault. Now Joan rode out in front of the English positions to try to provoke them to attack. They refused, resulting in a standoff. The English retreated the following day, but the Armagnacs continued their advance and launched an assault on Paris on September 8th. During the fighting, Joan was wounded in the leg by a crossbow bolt, but she remained in a trench beneath the city walls until she was rescued after nightfall, and the Armagnacs had suffered 1,500 casualties. The following morning, Charles ordered an end to the assault, but Joan was displeased, and she argued that the attack should be continued, and she and Alencon had made fresh plans to attack Paris, but Charles dismantled a bridge approach in Paris that was necessary for the attack, and the Armagnac army had to retreat anyway. Now, after the defeat of Paris, Joan's role in the French court diminished. Her aggressive independence did not agree with the court's emphasis on finding a diplomatic solution with Burgundy, but her role in the defeat reduced the court's faith in her. Scholars at the University of Paris argued that she had failed to take Paris because her inspiration was not divine. But in September, Charles disbanded the army, and Joan was not allowed to work with the Duke of Alencon ever again. Campaign against Perinet-Gessert. In October, Joan was sent as part of a force to attack the territory of Perinet-Gessert, a mercenary who had served the Burgundians and English. Now, the army besieged Saint-Pierre, L'Aumotier, which fell after Joan encouraged a direct assault on November 4th. The army then tried unsuccessfully to take La Charite, Laurie in November and December, and had to abandon their artillery during the retreat, and this defeat further diminished any reputation that Joan had. Now, now, Joan returned to the court at the end of December, where she learned that she and her family had been ennobled by Charles as a reward for her services to him and the kingdom. Before the September attack on Paris, Charles had negotiated a 4-month truce with the Burgundians, which extended which was extended until Easter of 40. But during this time of the truce, the French court decided that they had no need for Joan of Arc. Um, and here is another painting, or like a picture of Joan riding on horseback. Um, and you see that there. There is an art museum in Illinois, which is where I live at. I wouldn't mind hitting that back up again. They got some interesting paintings. They got a lot. They got a lot of Van Gogh and a lot of Monet and all that stuff over there. Be worth to check out. Um, Now, siege and capture. The Duke of Burgundy had begun to reclaim towns which had been ceded to him by treaty but had not been submitted. Um, Now, Compiègne was one such town. Of many in the area which the Armagnacs had recaptured over the previous few months, Joan set out with a company of volunteers at the end of March 1430, to relieve the town, which was under siege at that time. Um, this expedition did not have the explicit permission of Charles, who was still observing the truce he made. Um, so some writers suggest that Joan's expedition to Compiègne without documented permission from the courts was a desperate and treasonable action, but others have argued that she could not have launched the expedition without the financial support from the court. In April, Joan arrived at Milan, which had expelled its Burgundian garrison. As Joan advanced, her force grew as other commanders joined her. Joan's troops advanced in Lagny-sur-Marne and defeated an Anglo-Burgundian force commanded by the mercenary Francois d'Arras, who was captured. Now, typically, he would have been ransomed or exchanged by the capturing force, but Joan allowed the townspeople to execute him after a trial. Which I don't think she was allowed to do that. But anyway, now here's a mural of Joan captured by of Joan being captured by the Burgundians at Compiègne. This painting was done between 1886 and 1890, and it's at the Pantheon in Paris, France. So, now Joan would reach Compiègne on May 14th, but after defensive forays against the Burgundian besiegers, she was forced to disband the majority of the army because they had become too difficult for the surrounding countryside to support. Now, Joan had about 400 of her remaining soldiers. Joan and about 400 of her remaining soldiers would enter the town. Now, on May 23rd of 1430, Joan accompanied an Armagnac force which sorted from Compiègne to attack the Burgundian camp at Margny, northeast of the town. The attack failed and Joan was captured. She agreed to surrender to a pro-Burgundian nobleman named Lionel de Vendôme, a member of Jean de Luxembourg's contingent, who quickly moved her to his castle at La Fontaines near Noyes. Now, after her first attempt to escape, she was transferred to Beaurevoir Castle. She made another escape attempt while there, jumping from the window of a tower and landed in a dry moat, but she was injured but survived. But in November, she was moved to the Burgundian town of Arras. Now, the English and the Burgundians rejoiced that Joan had been removed as a military threat, but the English negotiated with their Burgundian allies to pay Joan's ransom and transfer her to their custody. Bishop Pierre Cochon of Beauvais, a Protestant supporter of the Duke of Burgundy and the English crown, played a prominent part in these negotiations. Now, which were completed in November, but the final agreement called for the English to pay 10,000 livres to obtain her from Luxembourg. Now, after the English paid the ransom, they moved Joan to Rouen, their main headquarters in France, but there was no evidence that Charles tried to save Joan when she was transferred to the English. Either he tried to or he didn't, but there was no evidence to prove that he even attempted to. Now here is Joan of Arc on trial in this painting. This is supposed to be Joan of Arc's trial. Um, that's actually a painting that's at the National Art Gallery in Washington D.C. Um, now, Joan was put on trial for hearsay on January 9th of 1431. She was accused of having blasphemed, she was accused of having blasphemed by wearing men's clothing and acting upon visions that were supposedly demonic. And refusing to submit her words and deeds to the church because she claimed she would be judged by God alone. Now, Joan's captures downplayed the secular aspects of her trial by submitting her judgment to an ecclesiastical court, but that trial was politically motivated. Now, Joan testified that her visions had instructed her to the English and crown Charles, and her success was argued to be evidence that she was acting on behalf of God. But if unchallenged, her testimony would invalidate the English claims to the role of France and undermine the University of Paris, which supported the dual monarchy ruled by English king. Now, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Joan's guilt could be used to compromise Charles's claims to legitimacy by showing that he had been consecrated by the act of a heretic. Cauchon served as the ordinary judge at the trial. The English subsidized the trial, including payments to Cauchon, and Jean Lemaître, whatever, who represented the Inquisitor of France. Now, all but 8 of the 131 clergy who participated in the trial were French, and 2/3 were associated with the University of Paris, but most were pro Burgundian and pro English, which led to Joan's downfall and basically her guilt because because they picked the people that they knew would be against her. Now, Cauchon attempted to follow correct inquisitorial procedure, but the trial had many irregularities. Back then, Joan should have been in the hands of the church during the trial and guarded by women, but instead she was imprisoned by the English and guarded by many male soldiers under the command of the Duke of Bedford. Now, contrary to canon law, Cauchon had not established Joan's infamy before proceeding with the trial. Joan was not read the charges against her until well after her interrogation began. Now, the procedures below were below inquisitorial standards, subjecting Joan to lengthy interrogations without legal counsel. One of the trial clerks stepped down because he felt the testimony was coerced and its intention was to entrap Joan. Another challenged Cauchon's right to judge the trial and was jailed, but there was evidence that the trial records were falsified. Now here is a picture of Pierre Cauchon presiding at Joan of Arc's trial. You can see that right here. Yeah, when it comes to history, there's a lot of fascinating stuff. Now, during the trial, Joan showed great control. She induced her interrogators to ask questions sequentially rather than simultaneously, and refer back to their records when appropriate, and end the sessions when she requested. Witnesses at the trial were impressed by her prudence when answering questions, but for example, in one exchange, she was asked if she knew she was in God's grace, and the question was meant as a scholarly trap, as church doctrine held that nobody could be certain of being in God's grace, but if she answered positively, she would have been charged with hearsay, but if negatively, she would have confessed her own guilt. Now, Joan avoided the trap by stating that if she was in God's grace, she hoped God would put her there, and if she was in God's grace, then she hoped she would remain so. But one of the court notaries at her trial later testified that the interrogators were stunned by her answer, but to convince her to submit, Joan was shown the instruments of torture. She refused to be intimidated. Cauchon met with about a dozen assessors, clerical jurors, to vote on whether she should be tortured, and the majority decided against it. Now, in early May, Cauchon had asked the University of Paris to deliberate on 12 articles summarizing the accusation of hearsay. Now, the university approved approved charges, but on May 23rd, Joan was formally admonished by the court. The next day, she was taken out to the churchyard of the Abbey of Saint Quentin for public condemnation. As Cauchon began to read Joan's sentence, she agreed to submit. She was presented with an abjuration document, which included an agreement that she would not bear arms or wear any men's clothing. It was read aloud to her, and she signed it. Now, back then, public hearsay was a big capital crime, in which an unrepentant or relapsed heretic could be given over to the judge of the secular courts and punished by death. Having signed the abjuration, Joan was no longer an unrepentant heretic, but she could be executed if convicted of relapsing into hearsay. As part of her abjuration, Joan was required to renounce wearing men's clothes. She exchanged her clothes for a woman's dress and allowed her head to be shaved, and she was returned to her cell and kept in chains. Now, instead of being transferred into ecclesiastical prison, but witnesses at the rehabilitation trial stated that Joan was subjected to mistreatment and rape attempts, including one by an English noble, and that guards placed men's clothes in her cell, forcing her to wear them. Cauchon was notified that Joan had resumed wearing male clothing. He sent clerks to admonish her to remain in submission, but the English prevented them from visiting her. Now, on May 28th, Cauchon had went to Joan's cell along with several other clerks, according to the trial record. Joan said that she had gone back to wearing men's clothes because it was more fitting that she dressed like a man while being held with male guards, and that the judges broken their promise to let her go to mass and to release her from her chains. She stated that if they fulfilled their promises and placed her in a decent prison, she would be obedient. When Cauchon asked her about her visions, Joan stated that the voices had blamed her for abjuring out of fear, and that she would deny them again. As Joan's abjuration had required her to deny her visions, this was sufficient to convict her of relapsing into hearsay and to condemn her to death. Now, the next day, 42 assessors were summoned to decide Joan's fate. But here is a picture of Joan getting ready to be burned at the stake, and you can see them tying her to like a cross stake, and that they're gonna get ready to burn her, because that's how she got murdered back then. She was burned at the stake, where they lit her on fire. That's painful to die that way. Now, the two recommended that she be abandoned to the secular courts immediately, and the rest recommended that the abjuration be read to her again and explained. But in the end, they voted unanimously that Joan was a relapsed heretic and should be abandoned to the secular power, the English, for punishment. Not really, not lately. I've been watching. I still watch it, but but lately I don't have any recommendations on any good ones. Now, yes, I do. I do follow Coco Lovelock, but she's not my type of person I would go for. But I like the black woman. At the age of 19, Joan was executed on May 30th of 1431 in the morning. So at about the age of 19, Joan was executed on May 30th of 1431 in the morning. She was allowed to receive the sacraments despite the court's process requiring that they be denied to heretics. Now, she was then taken to Rowan's old marketplace, where she was publicly read her sentence of condemnation. Now, at this point, she should have been turned over to the appropriate authority, which would have been the bailiff, for secular sentencing, but instead she was delivered directly to the English. and then she was tied to a tall plaster pillar for execution to be burned at the cross. She was asked to view a cross as she died, and was given one by an English soldier made from a stick, which she kissed and placed next to her chest. A processional crucifix was fetched from the church of Saint Xavier. Um, she embraced it before her hands were bound, and it was held before her eyes during her execution. Now, after her death, her remains were thrown into the Seine River. Um, Now here is a monument um, commemorating the rehabilitation of Joan of Arc. Um, the military situation did not change after Joan's execution. Her triumphs had raised Armagnac morale, um, and the English were not able to regain momentum. Now Charles remained King of France, um, despite the rival coronation held for the 10-year-old Henry VI of England at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in 1431. Now in 1435, the Burgundians signed the Treaty of Arras, abandoning their alliance with England. 22 years after Joan's death, the war ended with the French victory at the Battle of Castillon in 1453, and the English were expelled from all of France except Calais. Um, um, now, Joan's execution created a political liability for Charles, implying that this consecration as the King of France had been achieved through the actions of a heretic on February 15th of 1450. A few months after he regained Rouen, Charles ordered Guillaume Bouillet, a theologian and former rector of the University of Paris, to open an inquest. In a brief investigation, Bouillet had interviewed 7 witnesses of Joan's trial and concluded that the judgment of Joan as a heretic was arbitrary. She had been a prisoner of war, treated as a political prisoner, and was put to death without bias. Bouillet's report could not overturn the verdict, but it opened the way for the later retrial, even though she was already dead and couldn't defend herself. Now, in 1452, a second inquest into Joan's trial was opened by Cardinal Guillaume d'Estevaux, a papal legate and relative of Charles, and Jean Brahal, now the recently appointed Inquisitor of France, who interviewed about 20 different witnesses. The inquest was guided by 27 articles describing how Joan's trial had been biased from the start. Immediately after the inquest, d'Estevaux went to Orleans on June 9th and granted an indulgence to those who participated in the ceremonies in Joan's honor on May 8th, commemorating the lifting of the siege. For the next 2 years, d'Estevaux and Brahal worked on the case. Brahal forwarded a petition from Joan's mother Isabel and Joan's 2 brothers Jean and Pierre to Pope Nicholas V in 1454. Now, Brahal submitted a summary of his findings to theologians and lawyers in France and Italy, as well as a professor at the University of Vienna, most of whom gave opinions favorable to Joan. Now, after Nicholas V died in early 1455, the new Pope Calixtus III gave permission for rehabilitation trial and appointed these 3 commissioners to oversee the process. Now, Jean Juvenal des Ursins, Archbishop of Reims, Guillaume Chartier, Bishop of Paris, and Richard Oliver de Longueuil, Bishop of Coutances, they chose Brahal as Inquisitor. Now the rehabilitation trial began on November 7th of 1455 at Notre Dame Cathedral, when Joan's mother publicly delivered a formal request for her daughter's rehabilitation, and it ended on July 7th of 1456 at the Rouen Cathedral. And they heard, and they haven't heard, and they basically both had heard from about 115 witnesses. Excuse me. Now, the court found that the original trial was unjust and deceitful Joan's arbitration, execution, and their consequences were nullified. In his summary of the trial, Bruhal suggested that Koshan, a copy of the articles of accusation, was formally torn up. The court ordered that a cross should be erected on the site of Joan's execution. Joan's visions played an important role in her condemnation, and her admission that she had returned to heeding them to return to heeding them led to her execution. Now, now here's a picture of Joan of Arc again. Oh shit, hold on. There. That's supposed to be Joan of Arc again. Yeah, I'm sweating a little bit in this damn house. Now theologians of the era believed that visions could have a supernatural source. The assessors at her trial focused on determining the specific source of Joan having her visions. Now using an ecclesiastical form of yeah, they are starting right now. Forgot about that. My baseball team is getting ready to start. The Cubs. Kind of disappointed. I don't have cable, so I don't get a lot of their games. The assessors at her trial focused on determining the specific source of Joan's visions, using an ecclesiastical form of discernment of spirits. Now, because she was accused of hearsay, they sought to show that her visions were false. The rehabilitation trial nullified Joan's sentence, but did not declare her visions authentic. But in 1894, Pope Leo the 13th pronounced that Joan's mission was divinely inspired. Now, modern scholars have discussed possible neurological and psychiatric causes for her visions. Her visions have been described as hallucinations arising from epilepsy or a temporal lobe tuberculoma. Now, others have implicated ergot poisoning, schizophrenia, delusional disorder, or creative psychopathy induced by her early childhood upbringing. One of the promoters of the faith at her 1903 canonization trial argued that her visions may have been manifestations of hysteria, but other scholars argue that Joan created some of the vision-specific details in response to the demands of the interrogators at her trial. Now, many of these explanations have been challenged. Now, the trial records designed to demonstrate that Joan was guilty of hearsay are unlikely to provide the objective descriptions of symbols needed to support a medical diagnosis, because back then they didn't have a lot of stuff that we have now. Now, Joan's firm belief in the divinity of her vision strengthened her confidence, enabled her to trust herself, and gave her hope during her capture and trial. Now here is a bronze statue of Joan of Arc riding on horseback. You can see that there. That's a bronze statue that actually somebody made. That is pretty fucking amazing. All that stuff is. So here we go. Okay. That's shit. Okay. Now, Joan's cross-dressing was the topic of 5 of the articles of accusation against her during the trial because she's a woman, but she was constantly seen dressing in men's clothing during this time. Maybe, I don't know. She even though she was a woman, but she wore a lot of back then she wore a lot of men's clothing to get by into military campaign tactics. She could be. Now, Joan's cross-dressing was the topic of 5 of the articles of accusation against her during the trial. In the view of the assessors, it was the emblem of her hearsay. Her final condemnation began when she was found to have resumed wearing men's clothing, which was taken as a sign that she had relapsed into hearsay. Now, from the time of her journey to Shannon to her abjuration, Joan usually wore men's clothing and cropped her hair in a male fashion. When she left Vaucouleurs to see the Dolphin in Shannon, Joan was said to have worn a black doublet, a black tunic, and a short black cap. By the time she was captured, um, she had acquired more elaborate outfits. At her trial, she was accused of wearing breeches, a mantle, a coat of mail, um, mail being spelled M-A-I-L, a doublet, hose chained to the doublet with 20 laces, tight boots, spurs, a breastplate, buskins, a sword, a dagger, and a lance. She was also described as wearing furs, a golden surcoat over her armor, and sumptuous riding habits made of precious cloth. Um, Now, during the trial proceedings, um, Joan is not recorded as given a practical reason as to why she would cross dress. She stated that it was her own choice to wear men's clothes, and that she did so not at the request of men, but by the command of God and His angels. She stated that she would return to wearing women's clothes when she had fulfilled. Yes, she did. Her dad was a farmer. Um, and her mother's name was Isabel, but I'm not sure what Isabel did. She could have been just a housewife. Um, Now, although Joan's cross-dressing was used to justify her execution, um, the church's position on it was not clear. In general, yep, her father was a farmer, like a peasant farmer, and it was not uncommon back then for kids to wear different clothing back then so that they could do those chores around the house. Um, Now, although Joan's cross-dressing was used to justify her execution, the church's position on it was not clear. In general, it was seen as a sin, but there was no agreement about its severity. Um, Thomas Aquinas stated that woman may wear a man's clothes to hide herself from enemies, or if no other clothes were available, and Joan would do both, wearing them in enemy territory to get to shine on, and in her prison cell after her abjuration when her dress was taken from her. Um, Soon after the siege of Orleans was lifted, Jean Gerson said that Joan's male clothes and haircut were appropriate for her calling, as she was a warrior and men's clothes were more practical to wear. Um, now, okay, so now, going on. Um, Now, cross-dressing may have helped Joan maintain her virginity by deterring rape. Now, witnesses at the nullification trial stated that Joan gave this as one of the reasons for returning for men's clothes after she had abjured wearing them. Now, however, the scholars have stated that when she was in prison, wearing men's clothes would not only have been a minor deterrent to rape, as she was shackled most of the time, but for most of her active life, Joan did not cross-dress to hide her gender. Rather, it may have functioned to emphasize her unique identity, which was a model of virtue that transcends gender roles and inspires people. Um, Now, Joan's legacy is one of the most studied. Now, when it comes to Joan's legacy, she is one of the most studied people during that Middle Age time. Now, partly because her two trials proved a wealth of documents. Now, her image, changing over time, has included being the savior of France, an obedient daughter of the Roman Catholic Church, an early feminist, and a symbol of freedom and independence. Um, Now, Joan's reputation as a military leader helped drive the English from France began to form before her death. Just after Charles's coronation, Christine de Pizan wrote a poem called Jeanne d'Arc, celebrating Joan as a supporter of Charles sent by divine providence and reflecting French optimism after the triumph of Orleans as early as 1429. Orleans began holding a celebration in honor of the raising of the siege on May 8th. Um, Now, after Joan's execution, her role in the Orleans victory encouraged popular support for her rehabilitation. Joan became a central part of the annual celebration, and by 1435, a play called A Mystery of the Siege of Orleans portrayed her as the vehicle of the divine will that liberated Orleans. Now, the Orleans Festival celebrating Joan continues to be played in modern times here today. Um, Less than a decade after her rehabilitation trial, Pope Pius II wrote a brief biography describing her as the maid who saved the Kingdom of France. Louis XII commissioned a full-length biography of her around the year 1500. Um, Now, Joan's early legacy was closely associated with the divine right of the monarchy to rule France. During the French Revolution, her reputation came into question because of her association with the monarchy and religion, and the festival in her honor held at Orleans was superseded or suspended in 1793. Sorry, in 1803. So in 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte authorized its renewal and the creation of a new statue of Joan in Orleans, stating, "The illustrious Joan proved that there was no miracle which French genius cannot accomplish when national independence is threatened." Um, but since then, um, but since then, she has become a prominent symbol as a defender of the French nation. Now, after the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, Joan became a rallying point for a new crusade to reclaim Lorraine, the province of her birth. The Third Republic held a patriotic civil holiday in her honor. Now, on May 8th, to celebrate her victory at Orleans. During World War I, her image was used to inspire victory. In World War II, all sides of the French cause appealed to her legacy. She was a symbol of Philippe Pétain in France, a model for Charles de Gaulle's leadership of the Free French, and an example for the communist resistance. Now, more recently, her association with the monarchy and national liberation has made her a symbol for the French far right, including the monarchist movement Action Francaise and the National Front Party. Joan's image has been used by the entire spectrum of French politics, and she is an important reference in political dialogue about French identity and unity. Um, um, Now, Joan is a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. Um, she is viewed. Um, Now, here is a picture of Joan of Arc standing outside a church, and you can see that right there. That's supposed to be like a picture of her standing outside the church wearing battle armor. Um, so like I said, she's a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, and she is viewed as a religious figure in Orleans after the siege was lifted. Now, um, and an annual panegyric was pronounced there on her behalf until the 1800s. Now, in 1849, the Bishop of Orleans, Felix Dunlop, delivered an oration that attracted international attention. Now, in 1869, they petitioned Rome to begin beatification proceedings, and she was beatified. She was beatified by Pope Pius X in 1909, and canonized on May 16th of 1920 by Pope Benedict XV. Her feast day is May 30th, the anniversary of the date of her execution. Um, in an apostolic letter, Pope Pius the 11th declared that Joan be declared one of the patron saints of France on March 2nd of 1922. Now, Joan was canonized as a virgin, not a Christian martyr, because she had been put to death by a canonically constituted court, which executed her not for her faith in Christ, but for her private revelation. Nevertheless, she has been popularly venerated as a martyr since her death, and one who suffered for her modesty and purity. Now, in her country and the strength of her convictions, Joan is also remembered as a visionary in the Church of England, with a commemoration on May 30th, is revered in the pantheon of the Cow Day religion. Um, now, now during her lifetime, Joan was already being compared to biblical woman heroes such as Esther, Judith, and Deborah. Her claim of virginity, which signified her virtue and sincerity, was upheld by women of status from both the Armagnac and Burgundian English sides of the Hundred Year War, like Yolande of Aragon, Charles's mother, and Anne of Burgundy, and who was the Duchess of Bedford. Um, Now, Joan has been described as a model of an autonomous woman who had challenged traditions of masculinity and femininity to be heard as an individual. In a patriarchal culture, setting her own course by heeding the voices of her vision, she fulfilled the traditionally male role of a military leader while maintaining her status as a valiant woman. Um, merging, merging qualities associated with both genders, Joan has inspired numerous artistic and cultural works for many centuries. In the 19th century, hundreds of works about her, going from the 19th century on up, hundreds of works of art. Um, um, yeah, so in the 19th, going from the 19th century on up, um, hundreds of works of art about her, including biographies, plays, and musical scores, were created in France, and her story became fucking popular as an artistic subject in Europe and North America. By the 1960s, she was the topic of thousands of books, movies, and her legacy has become global and inspires novels, plays, poems, operas, and movies, paintings, children's books, advertising, computer games, comics, and popular culture across the world. Now, the only movie I ever seen of Joan of Arc was the one where Mila Jovovich from Resident Evil plays her. That's the only Joan of Arc movie I've seen, and that is a good movie. Now, that is the end of our story. Um, so, Joan of Arc, like I said, is a very popular figure. Tell me what you guys think of her. If you want to know more about anything else. But if you missed the beginning part of my video, I did mention somebody that I want you to check out. The only reason why I'm putting out his name is because he referenced my channel. Well, not this one, but he referenced the other one, the RBW King channel. So there's a guy that I used to work with named Darius Lindsay, who goes by the name Lanky Hustles. Lanky Hustles. The reason why he goes by Lanky is because he's 6'5", 6'6", and he does a lot of videos talking about side hustles. Now currently he's on a trucking journey. He just got a CDL, and he's been chronicling his journey as CDL driver. On this video here called his experience as a bus driver. The experience as a bus driver, if you want to check that out, talks about my channel, and he references the RBW King channel if you want to check him out. The least I can do when he mentioned my channel was to give him a shout out back. So since he gave me a shout out, I'm gonna give him a shout out back. If you're interested in trucking videos and CDL videos, he'd be a guy to watch. He has his own voiceover editor because he does not narrate the videos. He has somebody do it for him. He actually writes out a script and they read from that script. I don't have money for an editor, so anyway, so it's not like. Now, like I said, this is the end of the video. Okay, okay, like I said, this is the end of the video. You can check out Lanky Hustles if you because he referenced me in one of his videos. You can check him out at your leisure. He's a great guy to actually listen to. So if you want to check him out, if you want to check him out, feel free to. So this is the end of the Joan of Arc video. So we're gonna close this page out, and I'll name off several videos that I will bring up next week, and tell me which one you want me to do. Okay, so next week we have St. Patrick, even though St. Patrick's is usually held in March, but we could talk about the St. Patrick. Then you got Santa Claus, which will be mostly during Christmas time, but even though there is Christmas in July too, so we have St. Patrick, Santa Claus, Jesus, God, the country Egypt, or the Persian army, or the Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid army or empire. Tell me which one for next week would you want me to do, and we'll go from there. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. So I'm gonna go because I gotta get some stuff done. But if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Run the King, and make sure to leave a comment. Let me know what you guys are thinking. But also, I have a Patreon link. If you want to support my work even further, you can donate to that Patreon link to support the work even further. And thanks for listening.